The Moser Cie Streamliner is one of the most inspired sports watch designs that has surfaced in recent years. That is quite a bold statement to open with, but it truly is a bold watch in many respects. A brilliant use of industrial design, one that takes risks, dares to be different, and one that pairs well with a bold introduction from another equally disruptive company. To begin, when it comes down to developing a new design, especially in the watch industry, we have seen two ways of how the process is usually approached. Either by borrowing from your fellow competitors, from your own brand, or finding inspiration from influencers, outside sources. We generally always see the former, a brand borrowing an idea or a plethora of ideas from other brands, or from their own catalogue, whether that is down to laziness, expense, fear that moving out of your comfort zone will affect sales. It's hard to tell. Research and development is expensive. Now, if you are a part of an established brand that is very successful, you don't have to necessarily push boundaries. There is no need to cause a stir. Sure, the audience reaction might be lukewarm, but the end result is that your watches will sell regardless, especially if there is serious demand for your brand. What happens then when your company is not as well established? When you want to bring out a new line of watches but feel quite unsure about how to address your concept? You innovate. You put many hours into thinking through the process. You spend months looking at influences from different time periods. You ignore what other brands are fixated on and instead go your own way with an original idea. Why isn't this done often? Well, it's because it's difficult and can be very adverse at times. Finding originality or being original is extremely hard. There are so many external influences. It's so easy to replicate what someone else is doing. And here we arrive at the Moser Streamliner chronograph, a watch that legitimately looks like it has spent years in development. We usually hear claims that it took X amount of years to develop most new additions to any lineup, but this model in particular looks to be one that spent a lot of time as a prototype. Let's begin by addressing the movement, all new and exclusive to the Streamliner, an automatic flyback chronograph. Putting those three words together is already impressive. Often we will see an automatic column wheel or a manually wound flyback. Not so often do we see all three elements put together. But where most brands would either hide their movements behind a solid caseback or leave a giant rotor covering the components or use a myriad of bridges that hide some of the most intricate parts, what makes the Moser caliber so interesting is that the rotor is in front of the movement, sitting behind the dial, allowing the wearer to admire all of the components. And Moser, always being quirky with their approach, Eduard, the CEO, highlighted that there is a small tribute to Batman on one of the bridges. I'll give you a moment to look for it. You can see a distinct outline of his cowl with two pointed ears in the center of the mechanism. Cool, right? So the movement consists of over 400 individual parts. It uses 55 joules. It runs at 21,600 VPH, allowing for micromanaging when operating and reading the chronograph. It allows you to read a sixth of a second. Also note, it is very hard wearing, can be operated underwater, and in its new case is 120 meters water resistant. Yes, this watch should have your attention. To the actual design of the watch, the definition of the approach is in the name, Streamliner. It adopts a fluid form that flows from the bracelet into the case. We have seen so many watches take inspiration from Genta-inspired pieces. The idea to capitalize off the 70s aesthetic has been the one approach that all haute watchmakers use. So the usual idea of flat bezels, a full steel case with a bracelet that seamlessly integrates, maybe the use of screws as a feature, maybe the use of batons on the dial, a typical hour, minute and seconds layout with a date complication. There are a myriad of examples, and you should be seeing them now. So we do see a full steel case and integrated bracelet, but it is not your typical bracelet. It doesn't look like it is divided into individual parts. Where we typically see some elements are brushed, others are polished, the actual form and shape of the links is extremely complicated. They aren't just flat, but are actually three-dimensional. It is said that the design of the watch began with the form of the bracelet, and that much is clear. But as the bracelet flows into the case, there is a neutral balance between the parts. You notice that neither the case nor the bracelet has a real emphasis. There is no competition between the parts, they just are, existing on the same plane. The case has a cushioned aesthetic, and it is clear how much of 70s design influenced this piece, but in a different way. We see notable inspirations from watches like the Omega Speedmaster Mark II, vintage Hoyas from the same time period, Breitlings. And one of the most defined additions that makes the piece all the more interesting is the choice to adopt a bullhead aesthetic. The chronograph pushes being arranged on both sides of the case, with the crown being set at the 4 o'clock position, adds to the styling. It's as if the space around the entire case has been considered and allocated to the crown and pushes. Notice the channel that runs around the band of the case as well, mirroring the same flowing line of the bracelet links. Very interesting. Of course, what we see at first when we look at the watch is the face and the dial. What is so striking, and what really makes this watch feel so complete and minimalist in its entirety, is that the dial solely consists of a racing minute track that integrates with the tachymeter. No batons, no plots. A simple, easy-to-see racing dial that is separated by minute markers at every 5-minute interval. As far as design goes, this is a cut above the rest, a pure expression, and racing chronographs were the inspiration behind the piece. I don't think that needs much justification. It's very impressive to see just how readable the dial is without these markers and anchoring points. The large hands are capable of filling the vacant negative space. The red spot colors used on the chronograph hand and at the 5-minute markers creates a very clear relationship. You might now be asking, as I did, where are the subdials? Where are the running seconds? What has been done equally as well when expressing minimalism with the case is showing barely anything on the dial. The dial itself represents a 60-minute counter. It is in essence both a dial and a subdial, an approach that we don't see used at all nowadays. It's a very traditional approach to a chronograph dial layout, and it's so refreshing. When you consider that more often than not, you need to strain your eyes to read small dials, where you cannot see the elapsed minutes at a glance. This format makes the process of reading the dial much simpler. As the chronograph hand passes the 60 at the top, so another white hand that rests underneath the chronograph hand moves in 1-minute increments. The chronograph is also a flyback, meaning that you can reset the hand without stopping the movement. There is a use of either a brown finish or a black finish on the dial, which gives the piece an added 70s feel. So the presence of this watch is commanding. It has a distinct feeling that divides it away from so many other names that are all trying to capitalize off the steel watch craze. Instead of just creating a product with their name on it, the Streamliner has been considered and styled to fit the future we are moving towards. After a bit more examination, the only element I would adjust is to remove the large 60 on the dial and replace it with a smaller numeral and set it like the rest of the dial. What the larger numeral does is help center the eye. It allows for the chronograph hand to sit neatly in the center. It also helps emphasize its stopwatch aesthetic. But maybe I'm just a stickler who would want to see the simplicity of the dial and case carried all the way through. In a similar way to how Tesla unveiled the Cybertruck, the influences behind these two pieces of design are very different. We could say that they were taken from two very distinct time periods, the one from the 70s, another from the 80s. But the sheer boldness, almost audacity behind the origin of this vehicle, and its positioning next to the big names in the automotive industry shows a few things. Tesla is willing to take risks. They are willing to look back to past influences to help create a new direction for the future of the automotive industry. In a similar way then, when so many say that originality is dead, the Moser Streamliner shows us something different, an approach unlike any other, a risk to share a more refined, pure approach to a sports watch that harkens back to inspired 70s motifs, that many would consider not fashionable or mainstream nowadays. But it just goes to show how impactful design, thought, and patience can be. This watch is a real masterclass. Pity that only 100 are being made.